In this video, we're going to complete P5LAB together. So looking at the instructions here, let's determine what the program should do. It's going to simulate a customer using a self-checkout machine. A random float value will be generated, and that will be the amount that the customer owes. We should then prompt the user to enter the amount of money that they're actually going to put into the self-checkout machine. After that, the program should calculate how much change is owed, and then it should determine the amount of dollars, quarters, dimes, nickels, and pennies that are required to make the appropriate amount of change. We're going to use our previous program from P3LAB. So that's going to be in the branching module, which I believe is module 5. And you will need to go ahead and go grab that code and make sure you have it available, because it is a program that already actually does this part for us. Remember, we passed in an amount of change as a float value in that program. It converted it to an integer, and then it displayed how many of each coin was needed, right? So we have some code already that does that. We're just going to change it and put it inside of a function. All right, and that function is going to be named disperse change. It's going to take in one parameter that's going to be a float, and it will not have a return value. So this is not a value returning function. All right, we need to make sure our program has a main. That's where all of our logic will go. We will call the disperse change function from inside of our main function. All righty, so in order to generate that random float that's going to be the amount owed, you're going to use this code right here. And what this code is doing is it's actually getting a random value between 1 cent and $100. All right, so we're going to grab that value. Python is going to generate that for us. We will have no clue what that is until the program runs. And whatever value it gives us in that range, we are going to round it to have 2 decimal places, because money always has 2 decimal places. All right, then we're going to ask the user to give us the amount of cash that they're going to put into the machine, and we calculate how much change is owed. After that, we'll call our disperse change function, and to it we will pass the amount of change that is owed to the customer, and it is going to do all the work to tell us how many of each coin we need. All right, let's look at a sample of the program running. So first things first, it tells us how much money is owed. Remember that this is a random value that's going to be generated by some Python code, so we have no clue what this number is going to be until the program runs. Then we'll say to the user, how much cash will you put in the self-checkout? And just in this example, they used $80. They put it $80 into the machine. So that means that the customer is owed $3.52 in change. All right, and down here we have the output from the disperse change function, and it tells us how many of each coin is needed. So this is $3.50, $3.52. All right, so let's get to it. Over here I have a new Python program ready to go. I've already named it P5LAB underscore last name, first name. So you should do the same now. All right, after you've got it saved and named correctly, we always need our comment block, so put that at the top. And this program is going to be using user-defined functions. All right, so first things first, every single program moving forward, whether in this class or just coding in general, should have a main function. So let's go ahead and do it. Remember, we use the def keyword. That means we're going to define a new function. It's called main. And remember, every function always has a set of parentheses after it. We also put a colon here to tell Python that we're done with that definition. All right, so inside of here is where we're going to actually write our code. And remember that we have to be indented to actually be inside of the function. So I'm going to indent one time. I'm put a comment in here, and I'm going to say logic goes here. All right. Remember that until we actually call the main function, the code inside of it will not execute. We have to call the main function in order to run the code that's in there. And we do it like this. I should be all the way against the left margin. and we call a function by its name. All right, this function, main, it does not take in any parameters. It doesn't require any, so we do not pass any in when we call it. All right, so first things first, we need to write the code to generate the amount owed. All right, since we are going to want to use this amount owed later on in our code, we need to assign it to a variable. So let's think of one. I say we call it amount underscore owed. All right, and we are going to assign a value to it. So I use my assignment operator here, the equal sign. And now I'm just going to grab that code that was given to you guys in the assignment directions. All right, so remember this is the code that generates the random number. I'm going to copy it and I'm going to paste it in. All right, great. So now we have a variable that represents the amount of money that the customer owes to the store. And we probably need to display it. So let's look back over here. It needs to say you owe, and then we'll have the amount of money that they owe. So let's come back. Now, since we're going to be printing this variable amount owed, we're going to use an F string for that. So let's write a print statement. Remember, it's all print as a function too, so it gets a set of parentheses. And since we want to print a variable, we needed it to be an F string. All right. So I come inside the quotation marks and I say you owe. I'm going to put a colon and a space. And remember, this is a money value, so let's put in a $sign. Now I need to actually print the value that's stored in this variable here. All right, so if I want to print a variable in an F string, I've got to have a set of curly braces, and my variable goes inside of those curly braces. All right, so let's run this and let's see how it looks. Uh-oh, did you forget to import random? Well, I sure did. And it even says in the directions not to forget that. So let's say import random. We have to have this line of code for the random number to be generated. Let's try again. All right, so what's happening here is that there's a 0 out here after the 7, but it's not showing up because we didn't tell Python explicitly to print 2 places after the decimal. So let's come in here with this amount owed. Remember, that's a float, a decimal number, and we can tell Python to print 2 places after the decimal. So I say colon dot 2f, and that'll give me those 2 places after the decimal. Let's run it again to make sure. And we're looking good. So remember that since this number is being generated randomly by Python, it's going to be different every time we run the code. So when you guys are running and testing this program, please do not think that it's supposed to be this number right here every time. Remember that this example output is just one possible scenario of running the code. All right, this number is going to change every single time the code runs. You're going to have to look at the output and do a little bit of math and make sure that your numbers are coming out correctly. All right, let's go back to our code. And we've got that part working well. Next thing we need to do, let's look back at the directions. We need to say to the customer, how much cash will you put in the self-checkout? And we allow them to input some information. So we are going to come back to our code. We are going to need to create a variable to hold that amount of money that the customer puts in the machine. So let's say I'm going to create a variable to represent money put into machine. All right, so we create the name of this variable, right? You decide what your variables are named. I'm going to call it money in. All right, and remember that the thing that the user is going to be giving us is an amount of money. which should always be a float data type. It should always have a decimal and then 2 places after the decimal. So let's make sure to tell Python to convert whatever the user gives us into a float. And then we have to use the input function to actually grab that information from the user when the program runs. And inside of here, we need a string because we need to say to the user, how much cash will you put in the self-checkout? Question mark, and close up the quotes. All right. So now that we know how much money they're going to put in the machine, and we know how much money they actually owe, we can calculate the amount of change that they should get back from the self-checkout machine. So let's put a comment in here. Calculate change owed. We'll say to the customer. All right. So in order to do this, of course, we're going to create a variable. I'm going to call mine change. I'll just call it change. All right, that's good enough. And remember, I need my assignment operator because I'm going to assign a value to it. And the value that I'm going to assign is the amount of money that they put in the machine minus the actual amount that they owed. That'll tell us how much change to give them back. So let's say money underscore in minus amount owed. All right. Now what we've got to do is we need to print to the screen how much the change actually is. Notice we have a $sign and we've got 2 places after the decimal. We want to make ours look the same. So we're going to use the print function. We are going to be printing a variable this time, right? We're going to be printing the amount of change. So let's go ahead and use an F string. That way we can easily print our variable inside of the string. And I'm going to say change owed. I'm going to put a colon and a space. Remember, this is money, so we got to have a $sign in there. And then I'm going to open a set of curly braces so that we can print the value of our variable change. So let's give it a run and let's see if change owed comes out correct. All right, we owe $67.66. Let's say we put $70 in there. I'm going to hit enter. All right. So what's happening here is that Python is appending a whole bunch of zeros and some very small number to our change owed. All we want to see is this 2.34. So let's go back into our print statement and let's tell Python to only give us 2 places after the decimal. I'm going to close this out. I'm going to come right here inside the curly braces after my variable called change, and I'm going to say colon.2f. That will make it print only those 2 places after the decimal. Let's test it out. All right, we owe $67.44. I'm going to say that maybe I put $70 in there. I hit enter. All right, we're looking good. The math it's mathin'. All right, so that is the correct amount of change if they put $70 in, but they only owed $67.44. All right, nice. So let's check out the instructions. All right, the next part is for the program to actually display all of the coins that we need to make that amount of change, right? Not always $3.52, of course. These numbers will change every time the program runs. But we need to display the amount of coins needed to make the amount of change. All right. So this is when we need to actually create our second function. And in the instructions, it told us to call it disperse change. And it said it was going to take 1 float parameter. Remember that parameters are just pieces of information that the program or the function needs to do its job. All right. So we are going to call this function disperse change. Remember, when we're creating a new function, we use our def keyword, meaning we're about to define a new function. And this one is called disperse underscore change. Every single function gets a set of parentheses after it. And since we're at the end of our function definition, I put a colon. Now remember, this one requires a parameter. And I'm going to use the name change. All right. Meaning that when we call this function down in our main, we're going to pass into it the amount of change. So let's take a look at our P5LAB code that actually does all of this coin determining. All right, I've got it right here. All right. So let's go ahead and copy this code. I'm not going to get my comments at the top. You should have a comment block up here. We do not care about that, but I do want all the rest of it. All right, so I'm going to hit Control C, or you can go to the top and go to Edit and Copy. Now I'm going to paste this code in under my disperse change function definition. So I'm going to hit Enter. I'm actually going to backspace so that I'm all the way against the left margin. Now remember that all this code that we're about to paste in, it all needs to be indented one time so that it's inside of the disperse change function. It's going to be a real pain to indent every single line manually, so I'm going to show you guys how to do it all in one step. So make sure that you're underneath your disperse change function definition, and make sure that your cursor is all the way against the left margin, and paste all of your code in there. All right, so a lot of stuff just happened. All right, so let's scroll back up. All right, so I'm going to highlight everything from my first line after the function definition all the way down until the end of this code. I do not want to get any of the code from my main. That needs to be left alone. All right, so if you just see what all I've got highlighted here, I left out my def disperse change, but I've got all the rest of the code inside. All right, we go to Format, and we say Indent Region. That's going to indent every single line one time. All right. So let's take a look at the code that we now have inside of this function. First things first, in the old program, we would get the amount of change owed from the user, and they were just entering the amount of change owed right here. All right, let's think about this. In this program that we're making now, is there anywhere in here where we say to the user, enter the amount of change? There's not, right? Because this program is not allowing the user to tell us how much change is owed. It's doing it for us automatically, right? So we already know how much change we're supposed to give back to the customer because way down here in the main, we calculated it right here. So we're going to get rid of that line in the disperse change that allows the user to enter an amount of money. All right, and we don't need to print change owed again because we did that in our main. So I'm going to get rid of these 3 lines. All right. And if your code doesn't look exactly like this, that's fine as long as it works. So the first thing that we should do inside of disperse change is we're going to take the change variable, which should be a float, a decimal number, and we need to convert it into a whole number because that's how this program works. Its logic is expecting to get an integer. All right. And in order to do that, I'm going to take whatever the value of change is, I'm going to multiply it times 100, and that'll move the decimal 2 places to the right. Then I'm going to round that value. All right, so this is not actual Python code. I'm going to type this in as an example to show you guys what's happening. So let's say change was $5.74. All this code down here is expecting to get that value as 574. It's not expecting the decimal in there. All right, so what we do is we multiply by 100. That moves our decimal place to here. And then we round this value. And rounding it will get rid of the decimal completely. It will make it into a whole number, which we know is an integer. So make sure you've got a line of code that looks like this. And then I actually wrote a print statement in here so that I can see the amount of change after I've converted it to an integer. That way I can make sure all my math is mathing correctly. So I'm going to scroll down really slowly so you guys can just see what's going on here. Right, that's all the code from the P5LAB. And it ends here. This is the last line from that. And then we have our main function, which we defined here, and all this code that's inside of the main. All right, so there's one last thing to do. The last thing to do is call the disperse change function. And in order to do that, we always call a function by its name. So let's say disperse underscore change. And remember that when we created this function, we said, hey, you're going to have to pass in one parameter. And that should be the amount of change that you want to make. And we have right here the amount of change that we want to make. So let's pass that in as our one parameter. All right, so what's going to happen when it gets to this line here is control of the program will actually come all the way up to the disperse change function, and it's going to take whatever this value is. It's going to come up here and it's going to say, okay, let's start executing the code inside of the function. And where Python sees change, it's going to actually substitute it with the value that we sent in. All right. So let's give this code a run and let's see how it does. All right, so we owe $7.46. Maybe we will put in $10, press enter. The change owed is $2.54, which is correct. And the program successfully converted it into an integer. Awesome. And we're saying that's $2, 2 quarters, and 4 pennies. And that is correct. We add up all that change, it equals $2.54. So this line right here is not actually in the output in the example. It is perfectly fine if you have it in your code. As a matter of fact, I would highly recommend that you have it in your code so you can make sure that no errors are occurring going from this to this. All right, so let's run it one more time. Run it a couple times, test it out. This time around, we owe $91.73. I'm going to say that I put in $92. So 27 cents is owed, and that is 1 quarter and 2 pennies. That's correct. Alrighty, guys. So hopefully that helped you out understanding how to create a function and then call it. All right, we'll see you in the next video.